The late afternoon light slanted through the tall, dusty windows of the San Bernardino History and Railroad Museum, catching particles suspended in air that hadn't moved in decades. Maya Chen sat at the oversized oak table in the archive room, surrounded by a fortress of cardboard document boxes, stacked 3 high on either side of her workspace. The original blueprints of the 1948 Speedy Service System building lay spread before her like sacred texts, their edges yellowed and brittle, corners dog-eared, from years of handling by previous researchers who had never looked closely enough. Her laptop glowed with comparative architectural diagrams, overlay after overlay of mid-century American commercial buildings, each one catalogued with the methodical precision that had made her reputation in academic circles. Maya had always been this way, even as an undergraduate. Measure twice, photograph everything, cross-reference until the pattern emerges. It was this obsessive attention to detail that had earned her respect among culinary anthropologists, that had secured her tenure-track position, that had convinced her department chair to fund this research trip into the origins of American fast food culture. Her digital caliper sat beside a stack of reference books on American architecture, next to her camera with its macro lens for capturing the fine details of the blueprints. Every measurement she took went into her spreadsheet, every angle calculated and compared against her database of thousands of commercial structures from the 1940s and 50s. A chapter in her book about how standardization in restaurant design had shaped American eating habits, how the assembly line efficiency of fast food reflected post-war industrial optimism. Safe territory, publishable research, the kind of work that led to keynote speeches at conferences and citations in other scholars' papers. The burger had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. Her apartment near the university was probably just as cluttered as this archive room. Academic journals forming geological strata on her coffee table, food history books serving as impromptu bookends on every surface, her framed PhD from Cornell hanging above a desk piled with manuscript drafts. On her refrigerator at home, held by magnets, were photos from family dinners, her grandmother's kitchen table covered with traditional Chinese dishes, her mother teaching her to fold dumplings, images that reminded her why she'd devoted her life to understanding how food creates culture and culture creates food. Her colleagues respected this about her, the way she connected the personal to the scholarly, the way every research question came from genuine curiosity rather than careerism. Professor Richardson in anthropology had called her work rigorous but soulful. Dean Martinez had written in her tenure review that Maya Chen represented the best of what academic inquiry should be: passionate, precise, and profoundly human. She'd built a good life, a stable life. Her world made sense because she asked questions that had verifiable answers, because she worked in a discipline where evidence mattered and truth could be discovered through patient, methodical investigation. Document the architectural evolution of the restaurants, analyze how the design facilitated the speedy service system, draw conclusions about how physical space shapes consumer behavior and standardizes experience. Write the paper. Present at the annual conference. Move on to the next project. Everything proceeding according to plan, according to reason, according to the rational universe she'd built around herself. Maya set down her cold burger and picked up her digital caliper again, this time moving more slowly, more deliberately. She measured the angle of the main service counter relative to the entrance. Then she measured it again, then a third time, because the number didn't make sense. It wasn't that the angle was unusual, mid-century commercial architecture had plenty of interesting quirks, but rather that it was too precise. The angle was 23.5 degrees, held to a tolerance that seemed impossible for 1948 construction techniques. She pulled out her reference book on American commercial architecture and flipped through the examples. Nothing matched. No other restaurant, no other retail space, no other commercial building from that era used that exact proportion. The position of the windows, the spacing of the structural supports, each measurement she took deepened the puzzle. These weren't approximations or close enough measurements from builders working with standard lumber sizes. These were deliberate, mathematically precise relationships that followed no contemporary American architectural standard she recognized. Maya felt her pulse quicken, that particular sensation she'd learned to trust over years of research, the feeling that meant she'd found something. She opened her laptop and pulled up her comparative database, running the ratios through her analysis software. The program churned through thousands of building designs, looking for matches. While she waited, she photographed the blueprints from multiple angles, zooming in on the notations in the margins, the technical specifications written in a neat, precise hand by whoever had designed this structure. The match was with architectural principles from Sumerian ziggurats, sacred temples built in ancient Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE. She stared at the screen, certain she'd made an error. She ran the analysis again. Same result. The mathematical ratios governing the placement of key elements in the original McDonald's building corresponded with impossible precision to sacred geometry from the ancient world. Architectural proportions could only vary so much before buildings became structurally unsound. Maybe the designers had inadvertently stumbled upon ratios that humans find inherently pleasing, mathematical relationships that transcend culture and time. There had to be a rational explanation. She pulled out another sheet of tracing paper and began overlaying the McDonald's blueprints with a transparent diagram of the ziggurat of that she'd used in a previous research project on ancient food storage structures. She aligned the entrance points and started comparing proportions. Her hands were trembling slightly as she worked, though she told herself it was just the excitement of discovery, just the thrill of finding something unexpected in material everyone else had dismissed as thoroughly understood. The structural supports corresponded to the placement of ceremonial pillars. Even more unsettling, the famous golden arches, not yet part of this 1948 design but indicated in margin notes as a future consideration, were marked for placement at points that matched ancient Mesopotamian ritual markers, the spots where priests would have stood to perform sacred ceremonies. Maybe the McDonald brothers had been amateur historians. Maybe they'd read something about ancient architecture and thought it would be interesting to incorporate. But no. These weren't general approximations or artistic tributes. These were precise mathematical implementations of sacred geometry, the kind of knowledge that required deep study and careful calculation, the kind of intentional design that had purpose behind it. She pulled up another blueprint from later in 1948, after the restaurant had been operating for several months. Someone had made modifications, small adjustments to window placement, slight shifts in equipment positioning, but these changes only strengthened the geometric relationships to the ancient patterns. Whoever had designed this system wasn't just aware of Sumerian architectural principles, they were actively refining them, perfecting them, using a 1950s American hamburger restaurant as a vehicle for something far older than anyone had imagined. Maya examined the specified placement for speedy signage and promotional materials. Every single position corresponded to locations in Sumerian temples where sacred idols would have been displayed. The mascot wasn't just branding. According to these specifications, Speedy was positioned like a deity, his image placed at points designed for worship and ritual offering. There had to be a missing piece of information, some context that would make this make sense within the rational framework of historical research. But she'd spent 15 years studying food systems and architectural design, and she'd never encountered anything like this. The mathematical precision was undeniable. The symbolic correspondence was too exact to be coincidence. Someone had deliberately embedded ancient Mesopotamian sacred geometry into what the world believed was simply an efficient system for serving hamburgers quickly. Whatever she'd stumbled upon in these blueprints, it was something far stranger and more troubling than a story about efficiency and assembly line food service. Her hands had stopped trembling. The methodical process of documentation gave her something concrete to focus on, a task that made sense even as the implications of what she was documenting made no sense at all. She didn't know yet about the Anunnaki, about the suppression apparatus that had kept this secret buried for decades, about the danger that came with knowing what she now knew. And because she was Maya Chen, because her fatal flaw was an academic obsession that prioritized truth over safety, because she couldn't leave a question unanswered, even when her instincts whispered warnings she'd ignore until too late, she would keep digging, she would keep measuring, she would keep investigating until she understood exactly what it meant that an ancient alien civilization had somehow left its fingerprints all over the architecture of American fast food. The sun was setting behind the San Gabriel Mountains as she walked to her rental car, the blueprints converted to digital files stored safely in 3 separate cloud backups. Above her, the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. She didn't look up. She was already planning her next steps, already thinking about what other documents she needed to examine, already committed to following this mystery wherever it led. The ordinary world of academic research, of tenure-track positions and conference presentations and peer-reviewed publications was still there around her. But Maya had crossed a threshold in that archive room, even if she didn't fully realize it yet. The truth she'd begun to uncover would demand everything from her, her career, her safety, perhaps her life. And because she was exactly who she was, she would pay that price without hesitation, unable to turn away from knowledge, even when knowledge carried consequences she couldn't imagine. She'd arrived early, before the usual rush of professors grabbing caffeine between classes, specifically so she could catch Professor Richardson and Dr. Tamura before their seminars began. The 2 senior colleagues sat across from her at one of the corner tables, their coffee mugs leaving rings on the polished wood surface, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something else as she explained what she'd found. Maya had her laptop open, the overlaid images displayed in careful detail, the McDonald'S blueprints superimposed with the ziggurat diagrams, the mathematical ratios highlighted in color-coded annotations. She'd rehearsed this presentation, kept her tone measured and professional, presented the data exactly as she would at any academic conference. But she could see it happening, that look passing between Richardson and Tamura, that subtle exchange that meant they weren't taking her seriously. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the diplomatic precision of someone who'd mentored dozens of young scholars through various research-induced breakdowns. He suggested, as kindly as possible, that Maya had been working too hard lately. That pattern recognition was a wonderful tool, but the human brain was remarkably good at finding connections that didn't actually exist. That she should perhaps take a few days off, get some rest, return to the material with fresh eyes. The golden ratio appeared in Greek temples and Gothic cathedrals and modernist skyscrapers, not because of some hidden connection, but because certain mathematical relationships simply worked better for building things that needed to stand upright and please the human eye. She'd seen this before, Tamura said, when a colleague had become convinced that Victorian railway stations encoded astronomical data. Sometimes coincidence was just coincidence. Maya closed her laptop slowly, thanked them for their time, gathered her materials. She told herself they were probably right. She'd spent 3 weeks in archives, cross-referencing documents until her eyes burned, surviving on bad coffee and worse takeout. Of course, her judgment might be compromised. Of course, she might be seeing patterns where none existed. The rational explanation was that she was tired and had let her enthusiasm for the research overcome her methodological discipline. The alternative, that she'd actually discovered some kind of ancient architectural conspiracy embedded in fast food restaurant design, was ridiculous when spoken aloud in morning sunshine on a university campus where students were throwing frisbees and someone was playing guitar badly near the library steps. This was the real world, the ordinary world, where academic research followed established protocols and surprising discoveries were usually just surprising mistakes. Her office was a small rectangle on the third floor of the Humanities building, barely large enough for her desk, 2 filing cabinets, and a bookshelf that sagged under the weight of her food history collection. The window looked out over the parking lot. Not the most inspiring view, but Maya had never cared about things like that. She decorated the space with the same methodical attention she brought to her research: framed degrees from Cornell and Berkeley, a poster from the Smithsonian's food culture exhibit, a photograph of her grandmother's kitchen that reminded her why this work mattered. Then she opened the folder for her legitimate research, her paper on standardized menu development in post-war America, the safe scholarly work that would lead to safe scholarly publication. The document was already 30 pages long, well-structured, properly cited, exactly the kind of work her department expected from her. She typed a paragraph about the evolution of McDonald's menu between 1948 and 1955, how the simplified offerings reflected broader industrial trends toward efficiency and predictability. But her eyes kept drifting to the bottom drawer where she'd filed the anomalous blueprints. She'd tell herself to focus, manage another paragraph about standardized portion control, then find her gaze wandering again toward that drawer. The problem was that now she couldn't stop seeing potential significance in everything. The efficiency of the assembly line process, was that just industrial optimization? Or could it be a deliberate system designed for some other purpose? The mathematical precision of portion control, 16 ounces for a large drink, exactly a quarter pound for the patty, were those just convenient measurements or ratios chosen for reasons she didn't understand? Every standardized process she documented now whispered of hidden intention, of patterns beneath patterns. Maya knew the stories. Brilliant researchers who'd disappeared down rabbit holes of their own making, who'd sacrificed their credibility chasing connections that existed only in their pattern-hungry minds. But the folder in the bottom drawer sat there like a weight, pulling at the corner of her awareness no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. She'd convinced herself, mostly, that she'd done the right thing by stepping back from the architectural anomalies. She'd indulged a brief obsession. Her colleagues had provided perspective, and now she was returning to the rational world of proper academic inquiry. Her apartment greeted her with its familiar organized chaos. Academic journals stacked on the coffee table in rough chronological order, food history books serving as impromptu stands for her various plants, her desk covered with notes from her current research projects. She heated up leftover Thai food, changed into comfortable clothes, and settled onto her couch with her laptop to answer emails before bed. Maya almost missed it because it had gone into her spam folder, flagged by her email client as suspicious. But something made her check the spam folder that night. Later she would wonder if it was instinct or just luck or something else entirely. The sender was listed only as a string of random characters. The subject line contained 4 words that made her breath catch. "You found the first layer." This was obviously sketchy. Anonymous, encrypted emails were not how legitimate academic discourse happened. She should delete it, block the sender, perhaps report it to campus IT security. Every reasonable instinct told her to close the laptop and pretend she'd never seen it. Ray Kroc's 1954 contact and subsequent implementation of Anunnaki optimization systems represent only the surface layer. Attached files contain evidence of deeper integration. If your academic integrity matters more than your comfort, decrypt using the protocol indicated below. Maya recognized it immediately from her graduate coursework in ancient food systems. She'd written a paper on Sumerian grain storage that had required learning basic cuneiform. The character was Enki, the name of the Sumerian god of wisdom, crafts, and fresh water. Enki, who according to myth had taught humans the arts of civilization, who had warned humanity about the coming flood, who served as a bridge between gods and mortals. The attached files were password protected. The message provided no password, only a cryptic instruction about using the evidence you've already documented. Maya pulled out her notes from San Bernardino, her measurements and calculations. It took her 40 minutes of trial and error before she realized the password was derived from one of the architectural ratios she'd discovered, a 16-digit number generated by the precise angle between the service counter and the entrance. She understood with perfect clarity that if she opened these files, if she engaged with this anonymous contact, she would be abandoning her academic protocol. This wasn't peer-reviewed research. This wasn't following established scholarly methodology. This was conspiracy theory territory, the kind of thing that destroyed careers and reputations. But Maya Chen had built her entire professional identity on intellectual integrity, on the principle that truth mattered more than comfort. If these files contained genuine evidence, if there was even a possibility they contained genuine evidence, didn't she have an obligation to examine them? Wasn't that what scholarship demanded, following the evidence wherever it led, even when it led somewhere unsettling? Through her apartment window, she could see the golden arches of the McDonald'S 3 blocks away, their neon glow cutting through the darkness like a beacon. How many times had she passed that restaurant without really seeing it? How many times had she eaten there, treating it as nothing more than convenient fuel during long research sessions? Now those golden arches seemed to pulse with hidden significance, a symbol whose true meaning she was only beginning to glimpse. Maya told herself she was still being scholarly. She was examining primary source material. She was investigating an anomaly. This was what researchers did. They pursued unexpected findings, they questioned assumptions, they looked for explanations when the evidence didn't match the accepted narrative. She could maintain her academic standards even while investigating unconventional material. This wasn't scholarly investigation. This was following an anonymous conspiracy lead into unknown territory. But her curiosity was stronger than her caution. Her need for truth, stronger than her need for professional security. She'd always been this way. It was her greatest strength as a researcher, and she was beginning to understand, potentially, her fatal flaw as a person who wanted to remain safe. Her laptop's hard drive whirred softly as it processed the protected files. She took a sip of cold tea, her hands remarkably steady, considering she was potentially destroying her career and stepping into something dangerous that she didn't understand. The golden arches glowed outside her window, the files finished decrypting, and Maya Chen, culinary anthropologist and methodical researcher, crossed the threshold from her ordinary world into a reality where ancient aliens had somehow embedded their systems into American fast food, where academic curiosity could be deadly, and where the truth she'd dedicated her life to pursuing might exact a price she couldn't yet imagine. Behind her, reflected in her dark window, the McDonald's sign glowed like a marker for something far older and stranger than anyone had suspected. Maya was about to learn exactly how deep the layers went, how far back the conspiracy reached, and how thoroughly her comfortable academic existence was built on foundations that had just begun to crumble beneath her feet. The laptop screen glowed in the darkness of Maya's apartment, filling with decrypted documents that made her stomach tighten with each new line of text. The files unfolded like layers of an impossible archaeological dig, each stratum revealing something that shouldn't exist. Diagrams appeared first, intricate schematics that resembled circuit boards or microprocessor layouts, but annotated with cuneiform script along the margins. Technical specifications written in English sat beside ancient Sumerian characters, as if two civilizations separated by 5,000 years had collaborated on engineering documents. Heat lamp frequencies calibrated to specific hertz measurements that had no relationship to food warming. Spatial arrangements calculated with the precision of laboratory experiments. Traffic flow patterns described not as customer convenience features, but as data collection protocols and behavioral monitoring systems. Small devices embedded in heat lamp housings, described in the technical notes as frequency emitters. Modifications to the ventilation systems that the specifications called atmospheric ionization units. Every piece of equipment had been altered, enhanced with technology that the document suggested was monitoring something, collecting some kind of data from the customers who passed through those restaurants. Maya's hands trembled as she scrolled through page after page. The documents referenced Anunnaki optimization systems as casually as they might reference stainless steel specifications or electrical requirements. The technology described was impossible for 1950s engineering. Precise frequency generation, data transmission systems, behavioral modification protocols that assumed capabilities far beyond anything human science could achieve at that time. Or even now, Maya thought. Even contemporary neuroscience couldn't design systems that influence behavior through spatial arrangement and electromagnetic frequencies with the precision these documents claimed. The paper texture visible in the scanned images showed aging consistent with 70-year-old documents. Either these were elaborate, expertly crafted fakes, or they were genuine technical specifications for technology that shouldn't exist. But another part of her, the part that had discovered impossible architectural measurements in those San Bernardino blueprints, recognized that she was looking at evidence of something that transcended normal scholarly investigation. This was first contact with a conspiracy so vast and so carefully hidden that its very existence seemed designed to be dismissed as lunacy by anyone who stumbled upon it. The encrypted files had opened a door, but she needed context, historical verification, connections to known facts. Ray Kroc's personal archives were housed in the university library's special collections, materials that normally required formal research proposals and weeks of approval process. But Maya had faculty credentials that granted her access to restricted sections, a privilege she'd earned through years of legitimate scholarship and had never abused. The university library stayed open until midnight during the semester. Maya checked her watch. Just past 10. She grabbed her laptop, threw on a jacket, and drove through empty streets to the campus. The Special Collections reading room was located in the library's basement, behind security doors that required both keycard access and manual sign-in with the night attendant. Maya signed the log with her faculty ID, her handwriting steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The attendant barely looked up from his phone, waving her through with the bored indifference of someone who'd supervised countless late-night research sessions. Maya moved quickly through the rows, pulling up the catalogue on one of the public terminals. Ray Kroc's personal papers occupied 3 full archive boxes in Section D, Row 7. She retrieved them, using a book cart, wheeling them to one of the private study carrels near the back wall, where security cameras had limited visibility. She was supposed to submit a formal research request, detail her scholarly intentions, explain how these materials related to her approved research projects. Instead, she opened the first box and began photographing documents with her phone, working quickly and quietly, aware with every click of the camera that she was violating the academic ethics she'd spent her career upholding. The first box contained routine business correspondence, financial records from the early McDonald'S Corporation, legal documents related to franchise agreements. Standard archival material, exactly what Maya would expect to find. But the second box held Ray Kroc's personal journals, leather-bound volumes filled with his distinctive handwriting. Maya photographed the title pages, then began systematically capturing every entry from 1954, the year the encrypted files had specifically referenced. The entries were cryptic, clearly written by someone who knew these journals might eventually become public record. Kroc described meetings with consultants who provided revolutionary operational systems that would transform the McDonald's business model. Kroc's handwriting became erratic, the letters pressed harder into the page, ink bleeding through to the reverse side. Met with the consultants again today. They understood efficiency I couldn't comprehend. How do they know these things? The systems they describe, traffic patterns, equipment specifications, spatial arrangements, it's as if they've studied human behavior at a level that shouldn't be possible. When I asked where their knowledge came from, they simply smiled. Said humanity has had guidance before, said McDonald's represents the next phase. Customer satisfaction scores unlike anything in the industry. They say this is just the beginning. They say McDonald's can become a collection network for data on human behavioral patterns. When I asked what they planned to do with that data, they said I wouldn't understand the full scope, said I should focus on the business success and let them handle the broader applications. Kroc's journals documented a relationship with mysterious consultants who possessed technological knowledge far beyond 1950s capabilities. Consultants who spoke about McDonald's as if it served some purpose beyond selling hamburgers. The entries continued through 1954 and into 1955, growing increasingly disturbed and fragmented. Kroc seemed torn between his excitement at the business success these optimizations brought and his growing unease about the consultant's true intentions. She was returning the boxes to their shelf location when her phone buzzed. An email notification from the university library system. Unusual access patterns detected in your account. Your recent use of special collections materials has been flagged for administrative review. They had systems in place to detect when someone accessed Kroc's personal archives. The encrypted files, the anonymous warnings, they all made sense now. Direct research drew attention. She'd been flagged. And judging by how quickly the alert had arrived, that attention would manifest in physical form very soon. She signed out with the night attendant, noting how his bored indifference had been replaced with careful attention to her movements. He watched her walk to the exit, and she saw him reach for his phone the moment she passed through the doors. No obvious tales, but that didn't mean she wasn't being monitored. By the time she pulled into her apartment complex parking lot, her hands ached from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The vehicle was a late-model Crown Victoria, the kind of anonymous car that screamed corporate security or government surveillance. Two figures sat in the front seats, silhouettes backlit by the glow of a laptop screen. They made no attempt to hide their presence. This was meant to be noticed, meant to send a message. She unlocked her door, stepped inside, and immediately pulled the curtains closed. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she set up her laptop on the kitchen table, the one room in her apartment where the curtains were too thick for anyone to see through from outside. The subject line read, "Cease and desist notice unauthorized research." The message was professionally worded but unambiguous. Maya Chen was hereby ordered to cease all research activities involving proprietary McDonald's historical materials, to delete any photographs or copies of documents she had obtained, and to sign a non-disclosure agreement acknowledging that any further investigation would result in legal action. Before she could process the legal email, her phone rang. Department chair. Maya let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message with growing dread. Her chair's voice was tight with administrative stress, explaining that the university had received complaints about ethics violations in Maya's use of special collections materials. There would need to be an investigation. Her library access privileges were suspended pending review. She should come to the office first thing tomorrow morning to discuss the situation. She could preserve her academic career, return to conventional research, pretend she'd never discovered architectural anomalies or Anunnaki optimization systems or Ray Kroc's terrified journal entries about consultants who weren't human. Below the password was an address in San Bernardino, a location not far from the original McDonald's site. The anonymous sender was offering her deeper information, physical evidence, answers to questions that now consumed her thoughts more completely than any research question she'd ever pursued. They'd already flagged her research, stationed surveillance outside her apartment, pressured her university. If she continued, she would lose her job at minimum, possibly face legal consequences, potentially put herself in physical danger from forces she didn't understand. And if what she'd discovered was real, if McDonald's restaurants were actually data collection networks built using alien technology, if humanity's food systems had been infiltrated by the Anunnaki, if the most ubiquitous restaurant chain in history served purposes beyond selling hamburgers, then didn't someone have an obligation to expose that truth? A new folder opened, containing detailed maps of San Bernardino, architectural diagrams of a location marked only as original site, substructure level, and a time, 3:00 a.m. tomorrow morning. The files included warnings about surveillance protocols, instructions for avoiding detection, and a brief message from the anonymous sender. If you've reached this stage, you understand the stakes. The choice is yours, but know that once you see what lies beneath, there's no return to unknowing. Maya looked at the address in San Bernardino, at the time stamp for tomorrow morning, at the detailed instructions for what she'd need to bring. She thought about her career, her reputation, the stable academic life she'd built through years of methodical research and intellectual integrity. She thought about the surveillance sedan outside, about corporate lawyers with unlimited resources, about journal entries from a terrified Kroc describing consultants who weren't human. She was methodical about it, approaching this decision with the same careful attention she brought to all her research, even though she understood with perfect clarity that this wasn't research anymore. Her ordinary life of tenure-track positions and scholarly conferences and predictable research questions was finished. What lay ahead was unknown territory, dangerous and strange, leading to revelations that might destabilize everything humanity believed about its own history. She wrote a brief email to her department chair, not sending it yet, just drafting it for later, explaining that she needed to take emergency leave for personal reasons. Through her apartment walls, she could hear normal sounds. Neighbors watching television, someone's music playing, the ordinary rhythms of ordinary lives. Now she was simply acknowledging that reality, accepting the consequences of a curiosity that had always been her greatest strength and would now become her fatal flaw. She would go to that address tomorrow at 3 in the morning. She would see what lay beneath the original McDonald's site. She would pursue this truth wherever it led, even though she understood, with the crystal clarity of someone who'd just destroyed her own future, that the knowledge she sought would exact a price far higher than she could yet imagine. And Maya Chen, culinary anthropologist and methodical researcher, finished packing for a journey that would take her beneath the surface of reality itself, into spaces where ancient aliens had embedded their systems into American culture, where the golden arches marked something far stranger than a restaurant chain, where truth demanded everything and offered no guarantee of return. The San Bernardino History Museum basement smelled of old paper and neglect, the kind of archival space that existed in institutional blind spots where budget cuts happened first. Dim fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sickly green illumination across rows of metal filing cabinets that stretched back into shadows. Maya followed Sarah through the narrow aisles, her footsteps echoing against concrete floors that hadn't been cleaned in years. Sarah was mid-50s, grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing the comfortable shoes and cardigan of someone who'd spent 3 decades managing historical collections that most people never saw. She'd worked with Maya before on legitimate research projects, had always been professional and helpful within the bounds of institutional protocols. But now, Sarah moved with deliberate purpose toward the back corner of the basement, toward filing cabinets that weren't listed in any public catalogue. She stopped at a unit marked with faded labels. McDonald's Corporation, sealed by Court Order 1987. Sarah pulled out a key ring heavy with decades of accumulated access, selected one that looked older than the others, and unlocked the cabinet with the kind of practiced motion that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd violated that court order. She'd seen this before, researchers who discovered something uncomfortable, who then got pressured by corporate lawyers and institutional administrators to forget what they'd found. She'd watched good scholars get intimidated into silence, watched historical truth get buried under legal threats and non-disclosure agreements, and she was tired of it. Tired of corporations treating public history like proprietary information. Tired of watching knowledge get suppressed because it made powerful organizations uncomfortable. She was making Sarah complicit in whatever consequences followed, and Sarah was accepting that risk because sometimes the truth mattered more than job security. But the language was strange, filled with technical specifications that had no obvious connection to restaurant operations. Franchisees agreed to operational compliance monitoring and system integrity verification, with language more appropriate for defense contractors than hamburger restaurants. Clauses about equipment maintenance referenced frequency calibration and data transmission protocols. One agreement required franchisees to allow unannounced technical inspections by McDonald's Corporation representatives who would have unrestricted access to all structural and operational systems. Installations with legal frameworks that ensured compliance with systems the franchisees themselves didn't understand. Sarah watched from near the door, her role as lookout making her equally guilty if they were discovered. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere above them, the museum conducted its normal operations. Tour guides leading school groups through exhibits about railroad history, completely unaware of what was being documented in the basement below. 3 days later, Maya sat across from Daniel Chen in a coffee shop near MIT, far enough from her own campus that casual surveillance might miss the meeting. Daniel was her age, someone she'd known during graduate school when he'd been pursuing a PhD in information security before dropping out to work for a cybersecurity firm that did classified government contracts. They'd stayed friends, bonded by shared memories of brutal comprehensive exams and the particular camaraderie of people who'd survived graduate school together. He'd transferred Maya's encrypted files onto it using a thumb drive that he'd immediately destroyed in the coffee shop bathroom, paranoid about data persistence in a way that Maya found both reassuring and terrifying. Now he examined the files with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was seeing something that violated his understanding of what should be possible. His expression shifted as he worked, starting with the skeptical amusement of someone humoring a friend's conspiracy theory, transitioning through curiosity as the encryption architecture revealed itself, finally settling into serious concern that made Maya's stomach tighten with anxiety. Daniel had worked with military-grade encryption systems, had consulted for intelligence agencies on cybersecurity protocols. He knew what advanced data security looked like, and what he was seeing in these supposedly 1950s-era files was decades ahead of contemporary technology, let alone anything that should exist from 70 years ago. The files weren't just encrypted. They were organized according to systematic data collection protocols that suggested automated processing of massive information streams. Millions of microtransactions, each one creating detailed behavioral profiles. Decision-making patterns captured with psychological precision, social interaction data compiled from thousands of McDonald's locations globally. The file structure implied a surveillance apparatus operating at a scale that shouldn't be technically possible, even with current technology. The data collection systems the files described would require computing power that didn't exist until the 21st century. Yet the documents were supposedly created in an era when computers filled entire rooms and couldn't process a fraction of this information. The technological impossibility was undeniable. Either these were elaborate modern forgeries, or they documented technology that came from somewhere other than human innovation. Daniel agreed to help decrypt the deeper layers, his professional curiosity overriding his survival instinct. He was intrigued by the impossibility, unable to resist the challenge of understanding systems that violated every principle of technological evolution he'd studied. Maya recognized the expression. It was the same obsessive curiosity she saw in her own mirror, the fatal flaw of people who prioritize knowledge over safety. Maya spent the next 2 weeks conducting field investigations, visiting McDonald's locations across 3 states with concealed electromagnetic field detectors disguised in her backpack. She documented architectural consistency with the methodical precision that had defined her academic career, photographing the precise spacing of ordering kiosks, measuring the specific height of menu boards, mapping camera angles that provided comprehensive coverage of every customer interaction. The distance between ordering kiosks and the beverage station, exactly 3.7 meters in every location she measured. Menu board height, 2.3 meters from floor to bottom edge, never varying more than a centimeter. Camera coverage, overlapping fields of view that ensured no customer movement went unobserved. The consistency defied normal franchise variation, suggested centralized coordination beyond anything standard corporate franchising would require. But the electromagnetic readings were what convinced Maya she'd crossed from academic research into something fundamentally stranger. Her detectors registered unusual signatures emanating from specific architectural points, not from visible equipment like computers or security systems, but from the building structures themselves. The strongest signals came from structural supports, from specific points in walls where building plans showed nothing but standard construction materials. The frequencies were precisely calibrated, pulsing in patterns that suggested active data transmission rather than passive electromagnetic interference. Every location registered the same electromagnetic signature. Every location demonstrated the same architectural precision. Every location functioned identically, not just in terms of menu offerings and customer service protocols, but in ways that suggested coordination at a level far deeper than corporate branding guidelines. Decision-making patterns tracked through menu board eye contact analysis, social interactions recorded through audio pickup that exceeded normal security requirements. The surveillance wasn't just about theft prevention or employee monitoring. It was systematic data collection on human behavioral patterns compiled across demographics and geographic regions with scientific precision. The corporate contact came 2 days after Maya's most recent field investigation, delivered through a formal invitation to a downtown office building with the kind of architectural intimidation that expensive real estate provides. The executive conference room occupied an upper floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a power move that made visitors feel simultaneously elevated and exposed. 3 corporate representatives waited for her, 2 men and 1 woman, all wearing suits that cost more than Maya's monthly salary. Jennifer Walsh, Special Projects Division, McDonald'S Corporation. The title alone suggested organizational layers Maya had never imagined existed within a fast food company. They didn't deny her findings. Instead, they reframed her research as requiring proper context and security clearance. They spoke about her investigation as if it were a job interview rather than a potential legal problem. Generous compensation that would quadruple her university salary, the ability to conduct research with corporate resources rather than working against corporate resistance. All she needed to do was sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and agree that her findings would be reviewed for proper contextualization before any public disclosure. They presented it as collaboration, as the opportunity to investigate these mysteries with institutional support rather than facing institutional opposition. Dr. Walsh explained that Maya had discovered something significant, something that required careful management to prevent public panic and social disruption. The Special Projects Division existed precisely to handle researchers like Maya, people who were smart enough to find the patterns, but hopefully wise enough to understand that some truths needed professional oversight before public revelation. The generous compensation was a gilded cage. The exclusive access was conditional on their approval of what she could say about what she found. They weren't threatening her. They were offering her a comfortable way to stop being a problem. Maya left the office building, rode the elevator down from that intimidating height, and walked out into afternoon sunshine, feeling like she'd just been shown the edges of a trap. Red string connecting data points, like a detective show parody, except the connections were real and the pattern was undeniable. Laptop screens displayed maps showing global McDonald's locations overlaid with population density data, urban development patterns, major transportation corridors. The distribution wasn't random or purely profit-driven. Locations were selected according to principles that suggested goals beyond market optimization. The evidence accumulated with the inexorable weight of scientific truth. Behavioral pattern documentation across every demographic category: age, income, ethnicity, education level, family structure. Architectural consistency that defied the normal variation even heavily standardized franchises would show. Electromagnetic signatures present at every location globally, pulsing with coordinated precision that implied centralized control. The famous billions served counter that McDonald's displayed prominently, Maya realized it wasn't marketing hyperbole, it was tracking. It was a real-time counter of evaluation progress, of how many human behavioral profiles had been compiled through this global-scale monitoring system masquerading as fast food. This wasn't corporate overreach or aggressive marketing research. This was systematic observation of human civilization, data collection operating on a scale that suggested purposes far beyond selling hamburgers or optimizing franchise profitability. The Anunnaki connection that had seemed like conspiracy theory when she'd first encountered it in those encrypted files now seemed like the only explanation that fit the scope of what she'd discovered. The surveillance intensified as her evidence wall grew. Maya started noticing the same faces in different locations, corporate surveillance teams who no longer bothered to conceal their presence. A man in a grey jacket at the coffee shop where she met Daniel. The same man 3 days later at a McDonald's she was investigating 2 states away. A woman with distinctive red hair on the train when Maya traveled to visit Sarah, then standing across from Maya's apartment building that evening. The message was clear. We're watching, and we want you to know we're watching. Her laptop's battery drained faster than it should, the kind of power consumption that suggested background processes she hadn't authorized. She started leaving papers arranged in specific patterns on her desk, finding them slightly displaced when she returned home. Her laptop would be in sleep mode when she was certain she'd shut it down. The intrusions were subtle enough to maintain plausibility, but obvious enough that she'd notice if she was paying attention. And Maya was definitely paying attention. The surveillance wasn't trying to be invisible, it was deliberately conspicuous, designed to apply psychological pressure. The corporate representatives had offered collaboration, and this was what happened when you didn't immediately accept. They were demonstrating their capabilities, showing Maya that her movements were tracked, her communications monitored, her research documented. The message wasn't subtle. Collaborate or be contained. Take the generous offer or discover exactly how much they could make her life difficult. They'd shown her the comfortable path, consulting position, generous compensation, institutional resources. Now they were showing her the alternative: isolation, monitoring, the slow pressure of being watched constantly until she either accepted their offer or abandoned her investigation entirely. Maya picked up the card, felt its expensive weight, read the embossed letters of the Special Projects Division. She thought about her evidence wall, about Ray Kroc's terrified journal entries, about electromagnetic signatures in building structures, about behavioral monitoring systems operating at global scale. Because Maya Chen had spent her entire career believing that truth mattered, and she couldn't stop believing that now, just because the truth was dangerous and the people who wanted to suppress it had resources she couldn't match. Her fatal flaw was academic obsession that blinded her to danger, and she was going to follow that flaw wherever it led, even if it led to consequences she was only beginning to understand. The elevator rose silently through the corporate tower, each floor marked by a soft chime that counted Maya's ascent toward the kind of power most academics never witnessed. The McDonald's Corporation headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a glass and steel monument to commercial success, the building itself a testament to what serving billions of hamburgers could achieve. Maya stood alone in the elevator's mirrored interior, watching her reflection multiply into infinity, each iteration looking slightly more uncertain than the last. A receptionist who looked like she earned more than Maya's annual university salary guided her through security doors that required biometric scanning, down hallways lined with framed photographs documenting McDonald's global expansion, into a corner conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city sprawling below. Jennifer Walsh waited with 2 colleagues Maya hadn't met before, Marcus Chen, who introduced himself as Director of Historical Archives, and David Rodriguez, whose business card simply read, Strategic Integration. They wore suits that probably cost what Maya spent on rent in 3 months. The conference table was polished wood that reflected the afternoon light streaming through those intimidating windows, creating the impression of sitting suspended above the ordinary world where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. Red tabs marked sections requiring special attention. Non-disclosure agreements, intellectual property clauses, confidentiality requirements that extended perpetually beyond employment termination. The weight of it felt deliberate when Maya picked it up, substantial enough to communicate the gravity of what was being offered. The position was Senior Research Consultant for Historical Integration Projects, which translated to unlimited access to everything Maya had been risking her career to investigate. The salary was 7 figures annually, more money than Maya had imagined earning in her entire academic career. Research facilities that made her university's archives look like storage closets, computing resources that would allow analysis at scales she'd only dreamed about, the opportunity to work with the actual historical materials rather than fighting for restricted access. He spoke with the enthusiasm of a true believer, describing how McDonald's had become the world's most efficient food distribution system, feeding populations that traditional agriculture couldn't reach, standardizing nutrition across economic classes. The data was compelling, showing measurable positive impacts on global food access. Walsh's underlying message was equally clear, delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that made threats sound like helpful warnings. The alternative to accepting this offer was professional destruction. Maya's unauthorized access to restricted archives had violated institutional ethics and possibly legal statutes. Her surveillance of McDonald's locations with electromagnetic detection equipment could be construed as corporate espionage. The university had already suspended her library privileges and begun ethics investigations. Without corporate cooperation, Maya would face legal action, professional blacklisting, permanent exile from academic institutions. The choice wasn't really a choice. It was surrender dressed up as opportunity. Part of her recognized this as sophisticated containment, a gilded cage designed to transform her from threat to asset. But another part, the part that had spent weeks gathering evidence while being surveilled, that had violated ethics codes because truth mattered more than protocols, saw potential here. If she accepted, she'd gain access to everything. She could study the phenomenon properly instead of piecing together fragments. She'd have resources and protection rather than operating alone against corporate power. Rodriguez explained that what Maya had discovered wasn't conspiracy, it was evaluation. Rodriguez described it as benevolent infrastructure, not sinister surveillance. For 70 years, billions of people had been fed, while humanity's cooperation, creativity, and adaptability were measured through systems so subtle that no one realized they were being evaluated. Hunger reduction in areas where McDonald's established operations, economic opportunity creation through franchise systems that employed millions. Rodriguez presented it as the most successful humanitarian project in history, one that simultaneously assessed whether humanity was ready to join a larger galactic community. She explained that the Anunnaki evaluation was approaching completion. Humanity was nearing the partnership threshold, the point where Earth would be invited to join interstellar commerce, technology exchange, cultural integration with civilizations that had been traveling between stars for millennia. The McDonald's system, she said, had accelerated human development while providing the data necessary to determine humanity's readiness. Without it, Earth would remain isolated, unaware of the larger universe surrounding it. The surveillance wasn't exploitation, it was preparation for partnership. The Anunnaki weren't predators, they were mentors guiding humanity toward interstellar readiness. All that was required was completing the evaluation and accepting the invitation when it came. Maya's research, properly conducted with full context and resources, could help humanity prepare for that moment. They provided a hotel suite, corporate-paid luxury accommodation with views that rivaled the conference room's intimidation factor. Maya found herself in a space more expensive than anywhere she'd ever stayed, surrounded by the contract and supplementary materials that filled an entire briefcase. Technical specifications for the monitoring systems, historical data showing McDonald's correlation with global nutrition improvements, projections for humanity's interstellar integration, charts demonstrating that the evaluation was approximately 87% complete, suggesting partnership invitation might come within her lifetime. Regions where the corporation established operations saw measurable decreases in malnutrition, increases in economic opportunity, improvements in public health infrastructure. The data was legitimate. She could verify the sources, recognize the research methodologies, confirm the statistical significance. McDonald's had genuinely fed more people more efficiently than any system in human history. That was the question Maya wrestled with as evening darkened into night, as the city lights below her window created constellations that mimicked the stars humanity might soon reach. She'd spent her career believing in truth and intellectual honesty, but what if the truth was more complicated than simple good versus evil? What if the Anunnaki monitoring was genuinely benevolent, preparing humanity for opportunities it couldn't achieve alone? Her academic integrity found the rationalization attractive. She could study the phenomenon properly now, with full access and institutional resources. She could understand the complete picture rather than piecing together fragments while being hunted by corporate security. The salary would transform her financial situation, eliminate the stress of academic precarity, provide security her university position never offered. The research facilities would allow investigations at scales impossible in her current circumstances. But she also thought about the correlation between McDonald's expansion and reduced global hunger, about the potential for interstellar partnership, about the possibility that her conspiracy theory was actually humanity's cosmic coming-of-age story. Maya had always prided herself on intellectual honesty, on following evidence wherever it led, even when the destination was uncomfortable. If the evidence suggested the Anunnaki evaluation was benevolent, didn't honesty require acknowledging that possibility? She'd infiltrate the system, use their resources, learn everything they were willing to show her while preserving her capacity for independent judgment. She'd be protected by institutional structures while gaining insider access to truth. She could study the evaluation properly, contribute to humanity's preparation for interstellar partnership, fulfill her role as researcher and historian for what might be the most significant transition in human civilization. She returned to the corporate headquarters at the appointed time. Dr. Walsh, Marcus Chen, and David Rodriguez welcomed her with professional warmth that suggested they'd never doubted her acceptance. Maya signed the contract, her methodical mind noting the clauses even as her hand executed the signature that bound her to perpetual confidentiality. She signed the non-disclosure agreements. She acknowledged the intellectual property restrictions. She agreed that all research would be reviewed for appropriate contextualization before any public disclosure. Login credentials for classified databases containing 7 decades of collected data, every behavioral pattern, every demographic analysis, every measurement the evaluation systems had compiled. Original correspondence with the mysterious consultants. Technical specifications for every system modification implemented across 70 years. Architectural plans showing the evolution of monitoring infrastructure. Everything she'd been risking her career to access, now available with institutional approval. Walsh introduced Maya to other researchers in the Special Projects Division. Historians, anthropologists, behavioral scientists, all working to contextualize the evaluation data and prepare humanity for eventual partnership invitation. They were smart, credentialed academics who'd made the same choice Maya had, trading independence for access. They welcomed her with the camaraderie of people who understood the rationalization required to accept this position. Maya appeared to have won. She'd gained full access to the truth, protected by institutional resources rather than operating alone against corporate power. She had a comfortable office, advanced research equipment, unlimited access to classified materials. The surveillance teams had disappeared. She was no longer a threat requiring monitoring. Her university ethics investigation would be quietly resolved. Her academic career was salvaged, transformed into something more significant than tenure-track positions and peer-reviewed publications. It was a false victory built on rationalization, but Maya's academic obsession, her fatal flaw that prioritized knowledge over self-preservation, made her blind to the containment happening around her. She thought she'd crossed a threshold into deeper truth. She didn't realize yet that she'd simply walked into a more sophisticated cage, one that controlled through access rather than denial, through comfort rather than threat. The corporation had successfully transformed Maya Chen from independent investigator into institutional asset, and she'd participated willingly in her own containment, convinced she was gaining access when she was actually losing the independence that had made her dangerous. The false victory felt real enough, at least for now, as Maya settled into her new office and began studying classified databases that revealed the scope of what she'd stumbled into. She believed she was closer to truth than ever. She didn't understand yet how far from it she'd actually traveled. The security clearance for this level required biometric verification, a signed acknowledgement that unauthorized disclosure would result in federal prosecution, and an escort from Dr. Walsh, who watched Maya's reactions with the careful attention of someone evaluating a long-term investment. Massive curved screens formed a hemisphere around a central platform, creating the impression of standing inside a data sphere. When the systems activated, the screens filled with the global McDonald'S network, rendered as interconnected nodes, pulsing with real-time information flow. Millions of transactions per second created behavioral heat maps that shifted and evolved like living organisms. The visualization resembled a neural network, not metaphorically, but with the actual architectural structure of synapses processing consciousness itself. Transaction data flowed constantly. Order patterns, decision-making speeds, social interaction durations, demographic correlations. The system was processing behavioral information on a scale that shouldn't be possible even with contemporary technology, analyzing human patterns with precision that suggested purposes far beyond corporate marketing research. Walsh navigated the interface with practiced ease, zooming into specific regional networks, highlighting data flow patterns, demonstrating the real-time analysis capabilities. She explained that every McDonald's functioned as a processing node in this planetary scale monitoring system. The architecture wasn't just collecting data. It was running continuous analysis on human behavior patterns across every demographic category, measuring compliance with social norms, efficiency in decision-making, creativity in problem-solving, cooperation in group dynamics. The evaluation wasn't passive observation, it was active assessment of humanity's readiness for interstellar integration. Maya watched the billions served, counter-updating in real time on one of the displays, the number incrementing with each transaction processed globally. She'd always dismissed it as marketing hyperbole, but now she understood it was literal tracking of evaluation progress. Each transaction represented another data point, another behavioral profile compiled, another measurement added to the assessment determining humanity's future. The counter was approaching 300 billion, and Dr. Walsh mentioned casually that projections suggested the evaluation threshold would be reached within 15 years. But another part of her, the part that had spent weeks being surveilled and pressured, felt a growing unease at the scope of what she was witnessing. This wasn't academic research. This was comprehensive monitoring of human civilization, operating at scales that transformed individuals into statistics and populations into experimental subjects. Days later, Maya sat alone in the classified historical archives facility, surrounded by materials she'd spent her career dreaming about accessing. Marcus Chen had given her unrestricted access to archaeological databases that weren't available to conventional researchers, records that documented anomalies other historians had noticed but couldn't explain. She'd requested materials on ancient food distribution systems, following the same methodical research process she'd used in her academic career, except now the answers were classified and disturbing. Mesopotamian grain distribution temples from around 3000 BCE showed architectural sophistication that preceded known technological development by centuries. The temple complexes used standardized measurements, coordinated distribution networks, behavioral monitoring protocols embedded in ritual practices. The systems appeared impossibly advanced for their era, demonstrating efficiency principles that shouldn't exist until industrial standardization thousands of years later. Behavioral monitoring through carefully designed queue systems and transaction protocols. The famous bread and circuses policy wasn't just political appeasement, it was systematic data collection disguised as social welfare. Maya found references to other civilizations across different continents and time periods, each one developing sudden breakthroughs in food distribution efficiency, always accompanied by standardized architectural systems that appeared inexplicably advanced. Chinese granary networks during the Han Dynasty, Incan food storage and distribution systems, medieval European monastery bread distribution. Each system demonstrated the same pattern: impossible efficiency, architectural standardization, behavioral monitoring protocols, and a famous counter-tracking distribution progress: millions fed, billions fed, numbers that became culturally significant for reasons no one fully understood. The archaeological record showed consistent patterns of collapse within 50 to 200 years of achieving peak food distribution efficiency. Not gradual decline, but sudden civilizational regression, literacy rates plummeting, technology abandoning sophisticated systems for primitive alternatives, populations fragmenting into isolated communities. The collapses looked like coordinated resets, deliberate reductions of civilizational complexity back to sustainable but pre-technological levels. It was cyclical, repeating across human history, with different civilizations serving as test subjects. Previous human iterations had failed their assessments, though the criteria for failure remained unclear. What was clear was that failure meant controlled collapse, civilizational reset, multi-generational regression that erased technological progress and cultural memory. She found projection files deep in the classified database, materials that required special authorization Dr. Walsh had granted her after Maya had demonstrated sufficient compliance with institutional protocols. The projections showed two divergent scenario models with probability calculations that assumed accuracy Maya couldn't verify, but found terrifyingly specific. The partnership protocol scenario showed humanity successfully completing the evaluation and receiving invitation to join an interstellar network. The projections included technological transfers that would solve climate change, disease, resource scarcity, all the problems that made contemporary civilization feel precarious. Earth would become a participating member of a galactic community that had been coordinating species development for millions of years. The probability calculation for this outcome, 37% and declining. The projections detailed population reduction through infrastructure failure, technology abandonment through coordinated systems disruption, cultural memory erasure through multi-generational regression to pre-industrial conditions. Not extinction. The Anunnaki apparently weren't interested in eliminating test subjects, but regression severe enough that humanity would need thousands of years to rebuild. The probability calculation, 63% and rising. Maya sat in that climate-controlled archive facility, surrounded by evidence that humanity was genuinely facing existential assessment and currently failing. The benevolent framing Dr. Walsh had presented was incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. Yes, humanity was being evaluated for partnership with an advanced extraterrestrial civilization. But the stakes weren't just join the galactic community or remain isolated. The stakes were pass the test or experience coordinated collapse that erases centuries of progress. Every standardized procedure, every behavioral measurement, every data point collected through billions of transactions was being used to determine whether human civilization demonstrated compatibility with galactic partnership protocols. And according to the classified projections Maya was now viewing, humanity was trending toward failure, toward joining the archaeological list of previous civilizations that hadn't measured up. Late that night, Maya remained in her corporate office, the space that had initially felt like victory but increasingly resembled sophisticated imprisonment. She'd been working for hours on analysis of the projection scenarios, compiling notes about the evaluation criteria, documenting evidence that demanded immediate public disclosure. The implications were too significant to remain classified. If humanity was genuinely approaching a threshold that could result in coordinated civilizational collapse, didn't people have a right to know? Didn't the species being evaluated deserve awareness of what they were being evaluated for? Maya plugged it into her computer and began copying files. Projection scenarios, historical collapse patterns, evaluation criteria documentation. The process felt like betrayal of the institutional trust she'd accepted when signing that leather-bound contract, but her academic integrity demanded it. Truth mattered more than contractual obligations, especially when the truth concerned human civilization's survival. A message appeared on her screen in red text. External device detected. File transfer blocked per security protocol. This incident has been logged and reported to Division Security. Maya stared at the message, feeling her stomach drop with the realization that her insider access came with invisible constraints. She could view classified materials, but she couldn't copy them. She could study the truth, but she couldn't share it. She tried a different approach, opening her email to send a message to Daniel to at least warn him about what she'd discovered. The corporate network blocked the connection before the message could compose. External communication restricted. Research division personnel may only send messages to approved internal recipients. Please contact your supervisor if you require exception authorization. Her phone was provided by the Special Projects Division, probably transmitting her location and communications to centralized security systems. The security clearance badge hanging around her neck wasn't just identification. It was a tracking device that documented her movements through the building. Please contact security for escort authorization or wait until normal operating hours resume. Maya pulled on the door handle. It didn't move. The sophisticated electronic lock that she'd thought was for securing classified materials was also for securing her. The corporate division had given her access to prevent external investigation, transforming her from dangerous independent researcher into managed institutional asset. Her research was monitored, her communications controlled, her movements restricted, her discoveries documented and contained. She had all the information she'd risked everything to access, but no ability to act on it. The false victory revealed itself as perfect imprisonment, a cage built not from walls and bars, but from classified clearances and comprehensive surveillance. They'd provided access because they could control what she did with that access. She'd thought she was infiltrating their system to learn their secrets. They'd actually contained her investigation by absorbing it into their institutional structure. Let's meet tomorrow morning to discuss your work and ensure you have appropriate support for your projects. The surveillance that had been invisible during her comfortable compliance was now explicitly revealed, making clear that her agency was purely illusory. She could study humanity's evaluation and potential collapse with unlimited resources, but she couldn't warn anyone about it. She could document the cyclical pattern of civilizational resets, but she couldn't prevent the next one. She had achieved her academic dream of complete access to truth and discovered that truth without agency was just another form of blindness. The monitored computer tracked her keystrokes, and Maya Chen, culinary anthropologist whose fatal flaw was academic obsession that prioritized knowledge over self-preservation, finally understood the cost of the position she'd accepted. She'd traded her independence for information, her freedom for access, her ability to act for the privilege of knowing. The cage was sophisticated and comfortable, but it was absolutely a cage, and she'd walked into it willingly, convinced she was making a strategic choice when she was actually just choosing her own method of containment. She sat in her corporate office, the space that had felt like victory and then imprisonment, now becoming the observation deck for watching her academic life dismantle itself in real time. The message included perfunctory professional language about the museum's commitment to ethical protocols, but Maya could read between the careful phrasing. Sarah had lost everything: her career, her pension benefits, her professional reputation, because she'd unlocked filing cabinets for Maya's research. His cybersecurity firm had lost all its government contracts following a sudden comprehensive audit that found alleged security violations Daniel swore hadn't existed. The firm was facing financial collapse. Daniel had been personally blacklisted from federal security clearance, effectively ending his career in a field that required those clearances. He didn't directly blame Maya, but the timing was obvious. 3 weeks after helping decrypt those files, Daniel's professional life was being systematically destroyed. The official determination was suicide. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play. Just a retired executive who'd apparently decided to end his life in the same week that Maya's investigation started attracting serious corporate attention. Thomas had been the one who'd first mentioned the special consultants that visited McDonald's locations periodically, who'd suggested there were operational protocols that went beyond normal corporate franchising. He'd provided that information during a casual interview Maya had conducted months ago, when her research was still conventional academic work. Now he was dead, and Maya would never know if corporate pressure had driven him to despair or if something more deliberate had occurred. Everyone Maya had involved in her research had been neutralized with precision that suggested comprehensive surveillance and coordinated response. The message wasn't subtle. This is what happens to those who help Maya Chen. This is the price of involvement with unauthorized investigation. This is how thoroughly the system can reach into people's lives and dismantle them. She attempted to reach Daniel through his corporate account, only to find the email bounced back with an "account disabled" message. She sat in her office, surrounded by advanced research equipment and classified databases, understanding that her access to information was inversely proportional to her ability to help anyone. She could study the evaluation system that threatened human civilization, but she couldn't prevent it from destroying the people who'd try to help her understand it. Formal plagiarism accusations appeared in her published papers, with anonymous complaints providing detailed evidence that matched Maya's work with earlier obscure publications she'd never encountered. The fabrication was sophisticated. Whoever had created the plagiarism evidence understood academic research methodology well enough to make the accusations plausible to institutional review committees. Her academic social media accounts showed coordinated attack patterns that suggested professional reputation management in reverse. Former colleagues began publicly questioning her research integrity, noting that her recent work had taken concerning turns toward conspiracy theory. Students submitted anonymous complaints about her teaching, claiming she'd discussed inappropriate material in class sessions Maya could document she'd never held. The attacks multiplied faster than she could respond, creating an avalanche of institutional suspicion that buried her credibility under allegations she couldn't disprove without access to evidence that was either classified or fabricated. Professor Richardson, who'd once praised her as representing the best of what academic inquiry should be, posted a carefully worded statement on the department's website expressing disappointment in recent developments and noting that the university was conducting thorough investigations into serious ethics violations. Dr. Tamura published an editorial in an academic journal about the dangers of researchers abandoning methodological rigor in pursuit of sensationalistic findings, never mentioning Maya by name, but making the reference clear through contextual details. The corporate division was destroying her credibility with the same systematic precision they demonstrated in containing her investigation. Fabricated evidence appeared in her personnel files. Ethics violations materialized from anonymous accusations that institutional protocols required investigating. Her suspension from teaching and research activities came through automatically, triggered by the weight of allegations that Maya recognized as sophisticated forgeries but couldn't prove false without resources she no longer controlled. Walsh herself, appearing at Maya's office door with professional courtesy that somehow felt more threatening than overt intimidation. The same executive conference room where they'd presented the partnership offer, where they'd shown her projections of humanity's cosmic opportunity, but this time the lights were brighter, the atmosphere less welcoming, the message clearer. Walsh, Marcus Chen, and David Rodriguez sat across the polished table with expressions that mixed disappointment and clinical interest. They presented their revelation methodically, walking Maya through a timeline that reconstructed her entire investigation from its beginning. The anonymous encrypted email that had arrived after her San Bernardino discovery, they'd sent it. The cuneiform signature Enki wasn't from a mysterious whistleblower. It was from their psychological operations division, testing Maya's response to conspiratorial framing. The surveillance sedan outside her apartment hadn't been corporate security watching her. It had been theater designed to make her feel monitored, to study how awareness of surveillance affected her research methodology. Every discovery she'd made had been permitted access, information they'd allowed her to find because they were studying how researcher curiosity operated when confronted with existential truth. Marcus Chen pulled up visualizations on the conference room screens, showing comprehensive documentation of Maya's investigation. Every archive visit time-stamped and photographed. Every communication with Daniel and Sarah monitored and transcribed. Every electromagnetic field measurement at McDonald's locations recorded and analyzed. They'd been managing her investigation from the beginning, feeding her curated truth to contain the narrative, while simultaneously studying how an intelligent, methodical researcher would respond to discovering evidence of alien evaluation systems. The Special Projects Division had been refining containment protocols for managing researcher curiosity, and Maya's psychological profile had made her an ideal test subject. Her academic integrity made her persistent. Her methodological rigor made her systematic. Her fatal flaw, academic obsession that prioritized knowledge over self-preservation, made her predictable. They'd used her investigation to develop comprehensive protocols for managing future researchers who might stumble upon evaluation evidence. They'd created a comprehensive profile, not just of Maya's research, but of how to manage academic curiosity that threatened operational security. She'd believed she was uncovering truth. She'd actually been performing a scripted role in their institutional learning process. Every choice she'd made had been anticipated and managed. Every victory had been permitted. Every discovery had been stage-managed to serve their institutional knowledge development. The false sense of agency she'd maintained through her corporate employment dissolved into the recognition that she'd had no control at any point. The space no longer felt like home, if it ever had, after she'd started noticing surveillance. Maya moved through rooms she'd lived in for years, now hyper-aware of how thoroughly her privacy had been penetrated. Security cameras in the building hallways tracking her movements. Her laptop and phone compromised by monitoring software she lacked the technical knowledge to remove. Her communications intercepted before they could reach external recipients. Her research confiscated through the contract clauses she'd signed, making every discovery she'd made proprietary intellectual property of McDonald's Corporation. She had no allies remaining. Sarah fired, Daniel blacklisted, Thomas dead. No institutional support. Her university had suspended her pending ethics investigations that would result in termination. No professional credibility. Her academic reputation systematically dismantled through fabricated evidence and coordinated accusations. She possessed knowledge about humanity's evaluation and potential civilizational collapse, but no credibility to share that knowledge. She had evidence of cyclical Anunnaki resets across human history, but no platform to present that evidence. She understood the existential stakes of the McDonald's monitoring system, but no audience willing to listen to a discredited academic facing ethics violations and plagiarism accusations. They'd transformed her from dangerous independent investigator into cautionary tale for future researchers who might consider unauthorized examination of corporate historical records. They documented her investigation so thoroughly that they now understood how to manage similar curiosity in others. They destroyed her professionally while keeping her alive and aware, creating a living example of what happened to those who pursued truth that powerful organizations wanted suppressed. Her published papers were being formally reviewed for plagiarism. Her teaching was being examined for inappropriate content. the conspiracy theorist researcher who'd abandoned rigorous methodology for sensationalistic claims about ancient aliens and fast food surveillance. That was her legacy now. That was what remained of 15 years building academic credibility through methodical research and intellectual honesty. She looked out her window at the dark sedan, at the corporate security team maintaining permanent surveillance. She thought about the classified databases she'd accessed, about projection scenarios showing humanity approaching partnership threshold or reset protocol, with probability calculations that favored civilizational collapse. She thought about Ray Kroc's terrified journal entries, about archaeological evidence of previous evaluations, about the billions of people eating at McDonald's every day, without realizing they were participating in an assessment that determined their species' future. She'd been reduced from researcher to cautionary tale, from investigator to case study in how systems contained threats to operational security. Her academic career was finished. Her research was proprietary corporate property. Her allies were neutralized or dead. She was isolated, discredited, powerless, and comprehensively contained. This was her ordeal. Complete professional destruction and absolute isolation. Trapped with existential knowledge she couldn't share, surrounded by surveillance she couldn't escape, facing the reality that her fatal flaw of academic obsession had led her exactly where the corporate division had predicted it would, into perfect imprisonment disguised as truth-seeking, into absolute powerlessness masked as insider access, into the darkest moment where all seemed lost, and no path forward appeared visible through the suffocating weight of comprehensive defeat. Handwritten research journals, because keyboards left traces that surveillance systems could intercept, the physical artifacts of conventional academic work, before her life had become a performance monitored by invisible audiences. Most of the annotations were familiar. Measurements, architectural comparisons, cross-references to her database of commercial building designs. But one margin note caught her attention with the particular clarity that desperation provides, making overlooked details suddenly significant. A string of numbers written hastily near the bottom of a page, marked with a notation that read, "Archaeological anomaly. Investigate," followed by a question mark that suggested uncertainty about relevance. Maya didn't remember writing it, but she recognized her handwriting from months ago, before the encrypted emails and corporate recruitment and systematic professional destruction. The coordinates referenced a site near the original 1948 San Bernardino McDonald's location, accompanied by a citation to a geological survey from 1947. Buried in appendices that most readers would never examine, the survey mentioned an unexplained electromagnetic anomaly, discovered at the coordinates Maya had written in her margin notes. The report noted that the anomaly didn't correspond to any known geological formation or human-made infrastructure, then dismissed it as likely measurement error. Things got dismissed when they didn't fit expected patterns, when acknowledging them would require uncomfortable explanations. The original anonymous encrypted files, the ones the corporate division had revealed they'd sent as psychological testing, had referenced a physical location near the first McDonald's. Maya had dismissed that reference when she'd gained digital access to corporate archives, assuming physical investigation was unnecessary when she had classified databases. Now, facing absolute containment, that dismissed physical location became the only possibility for leverage she didn't have. Maya had studied the surveillance pattern for weeks, not because she'd been planning escape, but because her methodical mind couldn't help documenting patterns even in her own imprisonment. She knew the corporate security team's shift change occurred at 6:15 a.m. She knew the dark sedan's camera angles had blind spots near the apartment building's maintenance entrance. She knew her tracked phone reported her location constantly, making it a liability rather than a tool. Maya prepared carefully, assembling materials over days in ways that wouldn't trigger additional monitoring. She withdrew maximum cash from an ATM using her compromised debit card, knowing the transaction would be logged, but betting the surveillance wouldn't interpret cash withdrawal as preparation for escape. She borrowed a jacket from a neighbor under the pretense of needing weather-appropriate clothing for a corporate meeting, gaining an outer layer that wouldn't match her visual identification profile. She purchased a prepaid burner phone from a convenience store during an authorized errand, paying cash and hoping the transaction was mundane enough to avoid real-time flag. The morning of her escape, Maya left her tracked phone on her nightstand, playing ambient noise through its speakers to suggest her continued presence. She dressed in the borrowed jacket, grabbed her research journal and the burner phone, and exited through her apartment building's maintenance areas at 6:20 a.m., exactly during the shift change window when surveillance coordination was weakest. She used cash for public transportation, traveling a deliberately complex route through the city that confused visual tracking by changing trains multiple times and moving through crowds where individual identification became difficult. The coordinates from her margin notes led to an area without nearby roads or structures, accessible only by hiking through landscape that discouraged casual exploration. She'd told herself during the journey that she might find nothing, that this could be measurement error from a 1947 geological survey, that she was potentially destroying her last chance at survival for a desperate gamble based on a margin note she didn't remember writing. Then she saw the geometric patterns in the stone formation, subtle enough to dismiss as natural erosion if you weren't looking for them, but undeniable once noticed. The patterns matched architectural elements from the original 1948 McDonald'S, those precise angles Maya had measured in the museum archive, the proportions that had corresponded impossibly with Sumerian ziggurat geometry. The stones were arranged according to the same mathematical principles, as if this desert site and the San Bernardino restaurant were both expressions of a single architectural template. The stone patterns weren't random geological accident. They were deliberate construction, weathered by decades of desert exposure, but still maintaining their essential proportions. Maya examined the surrounding area until she found a nearby construction site, abandoned equipment suggesting highway expansion work that had been paused. She appropriated tools, a shovel, a pry bar, work gloves, and returned to the buried entrance, beginning the methodical excavation her academic career had never prepared her for, but her desperation made necessary. Carbon scoring marked the surfaces, suggesting this structure had been partially destroyed by fire at some point in its history. Maya photographed the scoring, documented the architectural details, noted symbols carved into the stone that matched the Enki cuneiform from the anonymous encrypted files. This wasn't recreation of ancient architecture. This was the original template, the structure that had preceded the McDonald'S system, the source from which everything else had been copied. The chamber contained technology that shouldn't exist, crystalline structures pulsing with faint bioluminescent glow, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when observed directly, creating optical effects that made Maya's eyes water and her head ache. The walls were smooth surfaces that felt warm to her touch despite the cool desert evening air outside, as if the structure maintained internal temperature through mechanisms she couldn't identify. At the chamber's center stood an array of crystalline columns, arranged in patterns that resembled communications equipment, but with design principles that bore no relationship to human technology. The crystals pulsed with rhythmic light, suggesting active operation despite being buried for decades. Maya approached carefully, her methodical researcher's mind trying to document what she was seeing while her instincts screamed that she was in the presence of something genuinely alien, something that proved every impossible claim she'd discovered in corporate archives. She used her electromagnetic field detector, one of the few pieces of research equipment she'd managed to smuggle in the borrowed jacket, and registered readings that exceeded the device's measurement capacity. The array was actively transmitting, broadcasting signals she couldn't decode, but could verify were real, physical, electromagnetic phenomena rather than hallucination or measurement error. Maya documented technical specifications visible on surfaces that resembled control panels, though the interface used symbols she didn't recognize, and organizational principles that suggested non-human cognitive architecture. But some elements matched diagrams she'd seen in corporate classified files, frequency modulation patterns, transmission protocols, data compression algorithms that shouldn't exist in structures built before human computer science developed those concepts. Non-human technology integrated with McDonald's operational designs, actively functioning in a buried chamber whose existence contradicted every official narrative about fast food history. Maya had irrefutable proof that the evaluation system was real, that extraterrestrial infrastructure had been embedded in human civilization, that everything she'd discovered wasn't paranoid conspiracy, but documented fact. She was preparing to exit the chamber when movement at the center of the crystalline array caught her attention. The pulsing light patterns changed, accelerating and intensifying as if responding to her presence. A surface she'd assumed was decorative wall materialized into something else, a display activating with her proximity, showing visual representations that her mind struggled to process, but gradually resolved into comprehensible information. The display showed humanity's position on a complex assessment matrix, a three-dimensional representation of evaluation criteria, too nuanced for Maya to fully understand, but which clearly measured multiple aspects of civilization simultaneously. Behavioral compliance, technological development, social coordination, creative innovation, each factor represented on axes that intersected in ways suggesting the evaluation was measuring humanity's compatibility with something larger, some framework that the Anunnaki represented but didn't fully explain. Each transaction at McDonald's locations globally contributed to this assessment, providing behavioral data that fed into calculations determining humanity's future. The display showed current progress. Approximately 287 billion evaluations completed, threshold estimated at 350 billion, projected completion within 14 years at current transaction rates. Maya watched as the display branched into projected outcomes, the same scenarios she'd seen in corporate classified files, but rendered here with detail that made their reality undeniable. Partnership protocol, showing humanity joining interstellar networks, gaining access to technologies and resources that would solve civilizational challenges. Reset protocol showing controlled collapse, infrastructure failure, technological regression to pre-industrial conditions that would reset human civilization and terminate the evaluation for at least several centuries. It was measuring compliance, efficiency, willingness to function as standardized components in larger systems. The criteria seemed designed to ensure conformity rather than collaboration, to assess whether humanity could be integrated into extraterrestrial frameworks without disrupting their established protocols. Maya realized with sick certainty that the Anunnaki evaluation wasn't offering humanity invitation to join a community of equals. It was determining whether Earth's population could serve functional roles in systems that predated human civilization by millennia. The partnership being offered might be more like employment than friendship, Earth becoming a resource colony, providing standardized labor and behavioral data rather than a genuine participant in interstellar society. She photographed the crystalline array, the warm surfaces that maintained impossible temperature, the symbols that matched corporate classified files. She gathered evidence that proved the evaluation was real, while simultaneously revealing its manipulative architecture, truth that was both worse and more complex than the corporate division's sanitized version had suggested. The display faded as Maya backed toward the chamber entrance, the crystalline structures returning to their rhythmic, pulsing pattern. She climbed back through the excavated opening into desert evening air that felt shocking after the chamber's controlled atmosphere. The sun had set while she'd been underground, stars emerging in the darkening sky with a clarity that urban light pollution never allowed. Maya stood in that desert darkness, holding evidence that would either save humanity or ensure her permanent containment, understanding that she'd crossed another threshold. She had truth now. Real, documented, irrefutable truth. The question was what to do with it, how to share knowledge that powerful organizations had spent decades suppressing, how to warn a civilization that was being evaluated without their consent for partnership that might mean subjugation rather than salvation. She had leverage, agency, the possibility of action rather than just contain knowledge. The ordeal had stripped everything from her, career, credibility, allies, security, but it had also freed her from the illusion that institutional systems would protect truth-tellers, that collaboration with power served anything except power's interests. Maya began hiking back toward civilization, toward decisions about how to use evidence that could destabilize human society or potentially save it, depending on how it was received. The stars overhead were the same stars that had watched the Anunnaki establish evaluation systems across millennia, the same stars that would witness humanity's choice between partnership as subordination or reset as regression. And Maya Chen, discredited academic whose fatal flaw had led her into this impossible situation, now carried the burden of truth that could determine which future her species would face. The device in her jacket pocket felt heavier than its actual weight, as if the video evidence it contained possessed gravitational mass proportional to its potential to alter human civilization. She had perhaps 48 hours before corporate surveillance systems triangulated her location through traffic cameras, transaction patterns. The inevitable digital traces even careful evasion couldn't completely eliminate. She checked into a budget hotel near the airport, a place designed for anonymous transients where guests asked no questions and desk clerks remembered no faces. The room smelled of industrial cleaning chemicals and carried the particular atmosphere of spaces occupied briefly by people passing through toward elsewhere. Maya sat on the bed that had supported thousands of temporary residents, pulled out her burner phone and watched the recorded evidence again. Crystalline structures pulsing with alien light, the evaluation display showing humanity's assessment metrics, technical specifications that proved extraterrestrial technology had been embedded in fast food infrastructure for 70 years. Maya possessed documentation that would shatter consensus reality, that would validate every conspiracy theory while simultaneously revealing that the truth was stranger and more troubling than even conspiracy theorists imagined. The power to transform human civilization sat in her phone's memory, waiting for her decision about what to do with knowledge that powerful organizations had spent decades suppressing. But Maya also understood the stakes now in ways she hadn't when her investigation began. The evaluation was real. Humanity was genuinely being assessed for compatibility with interstellar civilization, and her actions, what she chose to do with this evidence, could trigger humanity's failure assessment. She had power, but no clear moral direction for exercising it. Truth for its own sake no longer seemed like sufficient justification when truth's consequences might include civilizational collapse. Walsh arrived with Marcus Chen and David Rodriguez, the same representatives who'd offered her recruitment and later revealed her investigation's containment. But their demeanor was different now, weary rather than professionally cordial, carrying the exhaustion of people managing impossible situations rather than the confidence of institutional power. They simply asked if they could sit with her in the hotel lobby and explain the complete context she was missing. Their request was polite, almost deferential, acknowledging that Maya held leverage they couldn't forcibly remove. She agreed, curious about what framing they could possibly offer that would justify continued suppression. She began by acknowledging what Maya had discovered was real and significant. The Special Projects Division wasn't alien collaborators or corporate villains. They were humans managing knowledge that no institutional framework was designed to handle. For 70 years, they'd been containing disclosure, preventing premature revelation that would destabilize civilization before humanity developed the psychological and social capacity to integrate existential truths about non-human evaluation. He'd chosen containment after seeing comprehensive modeling of disclosure consequences, not because he believed suppression was morally correct, but because every analysis suggested that premature disclosure would trigger the exact civilizational instability that evaluation protocols interpreted as failure indicators. David Rodriguez admitted that the division had initially approached Maya's investigation as a containment operation, but had grown to respect her intellectual integrity and methodological rigor. The psychological testing, the managed disclosure, the systematic documentation of her investigation, all of it had been containment protocol. But Rodriguez noted that Maya had proven more persistent and resourceful than their models predicted. Her discovery of the desert site represented genuine independent investigation they hadn't anticipated or controlled. The evidence she'd gathered was real, and her question about what to do with it was legitimate. The representatives showed her simulation models that the Special Projects Division had been developing for decades. Comprehensive projections analyzing disclosure scenarios, ranging from controlled revelation through official channels to sudden exposure via social media or journalism. Each pathway was modeled for cascading consequences across economic, social, psychological, and geopolitical domains. The projections were methodically constructed, using historical data from previous civilizational disruptions, behavioral economics research, social psychology studies of mass belief revision, geopolitical modeling of resource competition under existential pressure. Maya recognized rigorous academic methodology being applied to questions no conventional research addressed. The models weren't propaganda. They were genuine attempts to understand what would happen if humanity learned about extraterrestrial evaluation while lacking psychological preparation or institutional frameworks for integrating that knowledge. Resource wars as nations competed for advantage under existential pressure, cooperation failing when cosmic stakes made zero-sum thinking seem rational, civilizational regression as international systems dissolved, populations fragmenting into isolated communities, pursuing short-term survival rather than collective coordination. Psychological breakdown at scales that overwhelmed mental health infrastructure, as billions of people simultaneously confronted the invalidation of fundamental assumptions about reality and human autonomy. Reset protocols would activate, not because aliens were hostile, but because the evaluation criteria interpreted civilizational chaos as evidence of incompatibility with interstellar partnership. Humanity would be judged as failed assessment case number, however many, they'd conducted across millennia of testing, subject to controlled collapse that erased centuries of technological and cultural development. Walsh presented the counterfactual scenario, the world as it currently existed with the McDonald'S system functioning. She pulled up global nutrition statistics showing measurable improvements correlating with franchise expansion, reduced conflict over food resources as efficient distribution networks eliminated scarcity-driven competition, economic stability enabling technological advancement, international cooperation, gradual progress toward the behavioral coordination that evaluation criteria measured. Humanity was genuinely close to passing the test, to receiving invitation for interstellar integration that would provide access to technologies capable of solving civilizational challenges that currently seemed insurmountable. The McDonald's system, whatever its origin and however troubling its surveillance architecture, had functioned as advertised, feeding billions efficiently while preparing humanity for cosmic contact through gradual behavioral coordination and social standardization. Disclosure now would waste decades of progress, plunging humanity backward when success was achievable through continued patience and institutional management. Suppression meant denying humanity agency over its own future, treating billions of people as subjects rather than citizens, making decisions about civilizational direction through elite consensus rather than democratic process. But disclosure meant potentially triggering collapse that would kill millions through resource wars and infrastructure failure, condemn generations to technological regression, and guarantee humanity's failure of an evaluation that success might enable transcendence of current limitations. Walsh paused at the hotel room door, looking back at Maya with expression that mixed respect and exhaustion. She noted that Maya had complete agency now. No threats, no coercion, no institutional pressure. The choice about what to do with evidence was authentically Maya's, and the division would respect whatever decision she made, even if that decision was disclosure that destroyed everything they'd worked to preserve. Maya sat alone in the hotel room after they left, holding her burner phone with its impossible evidence, understanding that she faced the moral crisis that had been building since she'd first measured those anomalous angles in the San Bernardino archive. The impossible choice between intellectual honesty and civilizational responsibility, between her need for truth and the potential consequences of revealing truth to populations unprepared for existential revision. Through her hotel window, she could see a McDonald's across the street, its golden arches glowing in the afternoon light. The digital counter visible from her vantage point displayed billions served, that number incrementing constantly as transactions processed globally. Every meal purchased contributed to humanity's evaluation progress, feeding people while simultaneously assessing their behavioral compatibility with cosmic systems they didn't know existed. Maya's methodical researcher mind tried to analyze the decision systematically, weighing consequences and moral frameworks. Utilitarian calculation suggested silence preserved the greatest good for the greatest number, continued stability enabling potential success rather than disclosure triggering probable collapse. Deontological ethics demanded truth regardless of consequences. Lying to humanity about evaluation denied people agency over their own cosmic future, treated them as means rather than ends. Virtue ethics asked what kind of person Maya wanted to be. Truth-teller who risked civilizational collapse, or pragmatic protector who accepted necessary suppression. She'd built her entire career and identity around belief that knowledge mattered more than comfort, that intellectual honesty was non-negotiable regardless of personal cost. Every instinct she'd cultivated through 15 years of academic research screamed that suppressing evidence was betrayal of her core values, that protecting institutional interests over human autonomy was exactly the kind of elite paternalism she'd always opposed. Yet the consequences projected by those simulation models weren't theoretical abstractions. They were comprehensive analyses suggesting that her disclosure would trigger suffering on scales that made her professional destruction look trivial by comparison. Millions potentially dying in resource wars, generations condemned to technological regression, humanity failing an evaluation they were genuinely close to passing, losing opportunity for interstellar partnership that might solve challenges currently threatening civilizational survival. If they'd threatened her or tried to confiscate evidence, Resistance would be clear moral path, but they'd respected her autonomy, provided comprehensive context, and left her to decide based on her own ethical reasoning what truth demanded versus what responsibility required. Parents feeding children, workers grabbing quick meals during shifts, billions of humans living within systems designed to assess their behavioral compatibility with cosmic frameworks they couldn't imagine, blissfully unaware that their civilization's future depended on continued stability, maintained through suppression of truth that one discredited academic now possessed power to reveal. Maya's academic obsession, her fatal flaw that prioritized knowledge over self-preservation, had brought her to this moment. But the choice she faced transcended personal values. This wasn't about her career or credibility or individual integrity. This was about humanity's future, about whether truth served human flourishing or human suffering, about whether intellectual honesty demanded disclosure regardless of consequences, or whether moral responsibility required accepting that some truths were too destabilizing to reveal. Then at her reflection in the hotel mirror, a woman whose pursuit of truth had stripped away everything except the question of what truth was actually for. The representatives had departed, leaving Maya alone with comprehensive information, authentic agency, and the impossible weight of choosing between values she'd believed were compatible, but now understood, were potentially contradictory. And there was no clearly moral option, no framework that resolved the dilemma without betraying something essential. Only the suffocating awareness that whatever she decided would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of billions of people who didn't know they were being evaluated and had never consented to having their civilizational future decided by one person's judgment about what truth demanded and what responsibility required. The internet cafe smelled of overheated electronics and stale coffee, occupying a dying commercial space in a neighborhood transitioning between identities. Maya sat at a terminal in the back corner, the kind of establishment that catered to people who needed anonymous network access and asked no questions about why. She'd routed her connection through multiple proxy servers, used cryptocurrency purchased with cash to pay for additional anonymization layers, employed every digital security technique Daniel had taught her during their collaboration before his professional destruction. Electromagnetic readings proving active transmission from buried structures, architectural documentation showing impossible correspondence between ancient sites and modern restaurants, technical specifications matching corporate classified files, a comprehensive archaeological and technological case that humanity was being evaluated by extraterrestrial intelligence through fast food infrastructure. Maya had spent hours preparing the analysis document that would accompany the evidence, writing with the methodical precision she'd cultivated through 15 years of academic research. She contextualized the discovery within historical patterns, explained the technical specifications in language accessible to general audiences, detailed the evaluation framework and its implications for human civilization. The document was thorough, credible, structured to withstand initial skepticism, while providing sufficient proof to compel serious investigation. It read like the academic paper she'd originally intended to write, before her research had spiraled into existential territory. The evidence would publish automatically to major media outlets, academic journals, social media platforms, and distributed file-sharing networks, unless she actively prevented it by entering cancellation codes at scheduled intervals. The mechanism was designed to ensure disclosure even if she was contained, killed, or otherwise prevented from completing the release manually. Ultimate leverage and ultimate responsibility, condensed into algorithms that would execute her choice regardless of subsequent pressure or persuasion. Around her, other patrons conducted their own anonymous digital business, probably nothing as consequential as deciding whether to reveal that humanity was failing an evaluation that determined civilizational survival, But who could know what burdens other people carried invisibly through ordinary spaces? A McDonald's occupied the corner across the intersection, its golden arches bright against the afternoon sky. Maya watched people entering and exiting, families with children, workers grabbing quick meals, students studying at tables visible through the restaurant's windows. The famous counter display showed billions served, that number incrementing as transactions processed, the assessment continuing without pause, while Maya decided whether to reveal what those billions didn't know they were serving. Children laughed at a birthday party visible through the McDonald's window, balloons tied to chairs, parents taking photos, the universal ritual of celebration playing out beneath architectural elements designed for extraterrestrial data collection. Traffic flowed past in normal patterns, people commuting to jobs and errands and appointments that constituted ordinary existence. The world operated according to familiar rules, systems that people trusted because they'd never been given reason to question whether fast food might be surveillance infrastructure, or whether their civilization was being evaluated for cosmic partnership that might mean subordination rather than salvation. About Daniel facing financial ruin after helping decrypt files. About Thomas Brennan, whose death was officially ruled suicide, but whose timing suggested consequences for providing information. About all the people her investigation had destroyed or damaged, casualties of pursuing truth that powerful organizations wanted, suppressed. If she pressed this key, billions more would become casualties of revelation rather than investigation, suffering through civilizational collapse that disclosure simulations predicted with comprehensive statistical modeling. She'd wanted to understand food culture's role in human development, to document how systems of nutrition shaped civilizational progress. The McDonald's network, whatever its origin and however troubling its surveillance architecture, had genuinely fulfilled that role. It had fed billions with unprecedented efficiency, reduced conflict over food resources, created economic stability that enabled technological advancement and international cooperation. The evaluation system was real, but so were its measurable benefits to human flourishing. Intellectual integrity demanded disclosure, but moral responsibility suggested that truth, without consideration of consequences, was destruction rather than enlightenment. She'd spent her entire professional life believing knowledge mattered more than comfort. But now she understood that belief had assumed knowledge would serve enlightenment rather than potentially triggering collapse. Her finger remained poised over the enter key, trembling slightly from the physical tension of holding position without committing to action. The dead man switch system waited for activation, algorithms ready to execute global disclosure that would shatter consensus reality and potentially condemn humanity to reset protocols that erased centuries of progress. All Maya needed to do was complete one keystroke, and institutional suppression would be circumvented, truth would be released beyond any possibility of containment, and billions of people would learn they'd been unknowingly participating in extraterrestrial evaluation of their species' readiness for cosmic partnership. She sat back from the terminal, looking at her reflection in the cafe window superimposed over the McDonald's across the street. Her face showed transformation that weeks of investigation and systematic destruction had carved into features that had once reflected comfortable academic confidence. She'd become someone different through this ordeal, not the methodical researcher pursuing conventional questions and not the obsessed investigator blind to danger until too late, but something more complex, someone who'd gained wisdom through impossible choice, who understood that truth required custodianship rather than just discovery. Truth without context was destruction, not enlightenment. Agency wasn't just about revealing information, it was about choosing what served human flourishing rather than what satisfied personal values. Maya's academic integrity had demanded investigation, and she'd pursued that investigation with the thoroughness her training required. But her evolved understanding recognized that some knowledge required protection and preparation. That disclosure without consideration of civilizational readiness was abdication of responsibility rather than fulfillment of it. The stakes were existential, and the consequences of failure were comprehensively documented in archaeological evidence of previous cycles. But humanity's response capability mattered more than immediate disclosure. Revealing truth to populations psychologically and institutionally unprepared to integrate that truth would trigger the exact civilizational instability that evaluation protocols interpreted as failure indicators. Maya could destroy consensus reality, or she could work toward preparing humanity for eventual disclosure when success was more secure and frameworks existed for managing the transition. Maya was choosing protection over exposure, but not destruction over preservation. The truth existed, documented and secured, controlled, but not suppressed. She was becoming a guardian rather than a whistleblower, accepting responsibility for both the evidence and humanity's chance at successful evaluation. She had evidence they couldn't suppress through traditional containment methods, but she was offering partnership rather than confrontation, recognizing that she and the corporate division shared the same ultimate goal: managing truth in ways that served humanity rather than destroyed it. She proposed new terms, genuine oversight role in preparing frameworks for eventual controlled disclosure, collaborative work toward developing educational systems and institutional structures that could handle revelation when humanity's evaluation status was more secure. Walsh agreed to meet at corporate headquarters, acknowledging that Maya negotiated from a position of genuine power now. She possessed evidence they couldn't suppress, but she demonstrated willingness to work within systems rather than destroy them. The meeting would be conducted as equals, discussing shared responsibility rather than adversaries managing containment. Maya traveled to corporate headquarters 3 days later, no longer needing evasion techniques because she was arriving by invitation rather than infiltration. The same building where she'd first been offered recruitment, where she'd signed contracts that contained her investigation, where she'd learned the full scope of what humanity faced. But her relationship to the institution had transformed. She wasn't coming as contained researcher or captured whistleblower. She was arriving as stakeholder in civilizational preparation for cosmic contact, someone whose evidence and understanding made her necessary partner in managing impossible knowledge. They'd been managing containment for decades, protecting humanity from premature disclosure while knowing their suppression made them complicit in denying people agency over their own cosmic future. Maya represented possibility of transforming that dynamic, of moving from pure containment toward gradual preparation. Maya would become genuine consultant with authority to review containment protocols and recommend modifications. She'd work with the division to develop frameworks for eventual disclosure, educational curricula that gradually introduced concepts of extraterrestrial contact, psychological preparation systems that built civilizational capacity to integrate existential truths, institutional structures that could handle revelation without collapsing into chaos. The goal was controlled disclosure timed to humanity's readiness rather than suppression until evaluation completion. But the alternative was maintaining pure containment until evaluation threshold, then shocking humanity with revelation they'd had no preparation to handle. The corporate division recognized that Maya's compromise offered better path than either continued suppression or immediate exposure. Consultation with psychologists and sociologists about managing collective belief revision. Development of educational materials that gradually normalized concepts of cosmic evaluation and extraterrestrial intelligence. all of it positioned as theoretical preparation for hypothetical contact scenarios, maintaining plausible deniability while genuinely building civilizational capacity for truth. The arrangement was imperfect compromise that satisfied no absolute moral framework. Maya was accepting institutional role in managing truth, becoming part of the system that suppressed disclosure even while working to prepare for it. She'd retain her evidence and her agency, but she'd use that power to transform suppression gradually rather than shatter it immediately. The choice embodied wisdom gained through impossible dilemma, understanding that perfect solutions didn't exist, that serving human flourishing sometimes required accepting complicity in systems she'd once opposed. She carried the burden of evidence that could still trigger global revelation if circumstances required. But she'd chosen guardianship over martyrdom, recognizing that truth served humanity better through patient preparation than through sudden explosion. She descended through conspiracy discovery, corporate containment, professional destruction, and existential dilemma. She'd emerged as someone fundamentally changed, guardian of truth that required protection, partner in preparing civilization for disclosure, stakeholder in humanity's evaluation by intelligences that had been assessing species' readiness for millennia. Her fatal flaw of academic obsession had nearly destroyed her, but surviving that destruction had taught wisdom that success might never have provided. She understood now that truth demanded more than discovery and disclosure. It required judgment about timing, context, and consequences. It required accepting responsibility for what revelation might unleash. It required choosing service over vindication, preparation over exposure, wisdom over righteousness. Maya walked out of corporate headquarters into afternoon sunshine, carrying evidence of humanity's cosmic evaluation and the weight of deciding how that evidence would eventually be shared. The golden arches of a nearby McDonald'S glowed in the light, billions served counter-visible from where she stood. The evaluation continued. Humanity approached its threshold. And Maya had chosen to work within the system, preparing her species for whatever came next, accepting the moral complexity of that choice, because wisdom meant recognizing that some dilemmas couldn't be resolved, only navigated with as much care and integrity as impossible circumstances allowed. Maya's new office occupied the fourth floor of a building designed to look like standard corporate real estate, but contained within its architecture the same hybrid purpose she'd come to embody. The space wasn't sterile corporate minimalism, nor was it comfortable academic clutter. Instead, it combined elements of both worlds. Research library merged with strategic operations center, scholarly investigation repurposed toward preparation rather than publication. On wall displayed replicas of ancient Sumerian artifacts, cuneiform tablets, and ziggurat architectural diagrams that documented the first iteration of evaluation systems millennia before McDonald's golden arches existed. The opposite wall featured contemporary operational data, screens showing real-time information flows from the global restaurant network, behavioral metrics updating constantly as billions of transactions processed across time zones. Past and present occupied the same space, visual representation of the continuity Maya now understood connected human civilizations across centuries through cycles of assessment most never realized they participated in. Her computer contained both academic research databases and access to corporate monitoring systems. Everything about the physical environment reflected her transformation from scholar pursuing conventional questions to guardian managing impossible knowledge. Her intellectual integrity remained intact, but it had evolved beyond simple commitment to disclosure. She understood now that truth required not just discovery and documentation, but judgment about timing, context, and consequences. Her research continued with the same methodical precision she'd cultivated through 15 years of scholarship, but her purpose had fundamentally shifted from public revelation to strategic preparation. The first months in her new role involved managing the moral debt her investigation had accumulated. Maya couldn't restore what had been destroyed. Thomas Brennan remained dead, official cause of death unchanged, his family left with grief and unanswered questions. But she could mitigate other suffering her pursuit of truth had caused, using resources her position provided to repair what damage remained repairable. She visited Sarah Mitchell at a small historical society in a neighboring county, the kind of local institution that operated on minimal funding and hired researchers who couldn't find positions elsewhere. Sarah had landed here after her termination from the San Bernardino History Museum, her 32 years of experience reduced to managing school tour bookings and processing donation records. The work was beneath her expertise, the salary barely covered living expenses, but Sarah greeted Maya without obvious resentment. Quiet financial support that appeared as anonymous grants to the Historical Society, specifically designated for archival projects that employed Sarah's expertise. Professional rehabilitation through invitations to conferences and consulting opportunities that rebuilt reputation damaged by mysterious ethics violations. Maya worked through institutional channels to manage consequences she'd caused, accepting that guilt couldn't be resolved but could perhaps be partially mitigated through practical assistance. Maya had no official role in defense procurement decisions, but her position as senior advisor for disclosure readiness frameworks connected her to divisions that interfaced with security infrastructure. Contracts materialized that matched Daniel's expertise, projects that restored financial stability and professional credibility. When Maya encountered him at a technical conference months later, Daniel understood without discussion that repair was occurring, that someone was trying to pay moral debts that couldn't actually be repaid. The moral calculus was impossibly inadequate. Money didn't balance a life, but leaving survivors with nothing felt like compounding the original wrong. Maya lived with the complexity of being both cause of suffering and partial mitigator of consequences, neither fully vindicated nor fully guilty, existing in the uncomfortable middle territory where most actual human ethics operated. Her office screens displayed data that once would have seemed like science fiction conspiracy theory, but now constituted her daily professional responsibility. The global McDonald'S network, rendered as interconnected processing nodes, real-time behavioral metrics flowing through systems most customers never imagined existed. The famous billions served counter continued its steady climb, currently at 293 billion evaluations completed, approaching the threshold estimated at 350 billion, with projections suggesting completion within 7 to 9 years. Efficiency measurements reflected technological advancement and social standardization. Adaptability indicators demonstrated human capacity for behavioral flexibility and innovation. The assessment suggested that humanity was learning, slowly and often painfully, the patterns that evaluation criteria measured. Partnership protocol activation was becoming increasingly probable rather than just theoretically possible. Maya monitored this progress with insider understanding unavailable to populations being assessed. She watched humanity unknowingly approach the threshold of cosmic contact, seeing patterns in aggregate data that individuals experiencing those patterns couldn't perceive. Her role involved preparing disclosure frameworks for when evaluation concluded positively, creating educational systems and institutional structures that could manage revelation without triggering the civilizational collapse that premature exposure would cause. She consulted with psychologists about managing collective belief revision at population scales. She worked with government agencies to establish protocols for handling cosmic contact revelation, building institutional capacity for truths that currently no framework existed to contain. All of it positioned as theoretical preparation for hypothetical scenarios, maintaining plausible deniability while genuinely building civilizational readiness. The work was meaningful but profoundly isolating. Maya lived with dual awareness that separated her from ordinary human experience. She shopped in grocery stores where other customers moved through mundane decisions about produce and household supplies, unaware they existed within evaluation systems measuring their species' cosmic readiness. She ordered coffee in cafes where conversations about work stress and relationship problems proceeded without knowledge that human civilization faced existential assessment. She walked through university campuses where students worried about exams and career prospects, blissfully ignorant of thresholds approaching that would determine whether their generation would witness humanity's integration into interstellar civilization or its controlled regression to pre-technological conditions. Maya couldn't avoid them. They were ubiquitous, woven into urban landscapes and highway corridors, present in shopping centers and airport terminals. She'd watch families eating meals together, children laughing over happy meals, parents managing the chaos of feeding kids in public, birthday parties with balloons and cake, exactly as she'd seen through the cafe window when deciding whether to trigger disclosure. Workers grabbing quick food between shifts, students studying at tables, elderly couples sharing burgers and conversation. She experienced profound cognitive dissonance, watching people be evaluated, seeing them as both individuals living their lives and as data points in extraterrestrial algorithms, measuring civilizational compatibility with partnerships that might mean subordination rather than genuine collaboration. Maya wondered daily if she'd made the right decision, if choosing guardianship over disclosure served humanity or betrayed it. Would the partnership that successful evaluation offered genuinely benefit human flourishing? Or would it integrate Earth into systems that exploited rather than elevated? Was she protecting civilization through strategic patience? Or was she complicit in denial of agency that people deserved regardless of consequences? She lived with questions that had no definitive answers, only choices made under comprehensive uncertainty. The evidence remained in encrypted storage, accessible if circumstances changed and disclosure became necessary. But for now, Maya had chosen preparation over revelation, accepting the Guardian's burden of knowing what others didn't and carrying the isolation that knowledge imposed. 6 years into her new role, Maya sat in an archive room that physically resembled the space where her investigation had begun, but served entirely different purposes. She conducted research, surrounded by documents and reference materials. Methodical and absorbed in her work exactly as she'd been that afternoon in San Bernardino when impossible measurements had first suggested something was wrong. But now she researched disclosure pedagogy and cosmic contact preparation, rather than food culture's role in American standardization. She analyzed frameworks for managing civilizational paradigm shifts rather than documenting architectural anomalies. Maya glanced at them with expression that carried complex understanding accumulated through investigation, betrayal, destruction, impossible choice, and cautious rebuilding. The arches weren't innocent corporate symbols anymore. She could never see them with the comfortable ignorance she'd possessed before measuring those angles. But they also weren't purely sinister conspiracy evidence, the interpretation she'd held briefly when everything seemed like surveillance and control. They were simultaneously fast food restaurants feeding billions efficiently, monitoring systems collecting behavioral data for extraterrestrial evaluation, and bridges to cosmic partnership that might elevate or subordinate humanity depending on terms that remained unclear. They represented the fundamental ambiguity of the situation Maya had chosen to manage rather than expose. Humanity's relationship with alien intelligence that was neither purely benevolent nor straightforwardly exploitative, but something more complex that simple narratives couldn't capture. She'd started her investigation believing academic integrity meant pursuing knowledge for publication, that intellectual honesty demanded immediate disclosure regardless of consequences. She'd learned through suffering and wisdom, gained from standing at thresholds of civilizational destruction, that truth required custodianship, that some knowledge demanded preparation before revelation, that responsibility meant accepting moral complexity rather than seeking simple vindication. The ordinary world continued around her, billions of people living ordinary lives protected by her choice to guard rather than expose. Whether she'd saved civilization or betrayed it would depend on whether evaluation succeeded or failed in the years ahead, whether partnership offered genuine elevation or subtle subordination, whether her preparation frameworks enabled managed transition or merely delayed inevitable collapse. Maya couldn't know yet which outcome would materialize. She could only continue her work, managing impossible knowledge with as much integrity and care as circumstances allowed, living with permanent uncertainty about whether her choice had served truth or merely served institutional interests that found her useful. The burden was immense and permanent, but it was hers to carry now. Guardian of secrets that could shatter or prepare civilization, depending on timing and context, and all the variables she tried to control, but never fully could. And Maya Chen, transformed from methodical researcher into strategic guardian, continued preparing frameworks for the revelation that would eventually come, whether through successful partnership invitation or failed reset protocol. Whether her work enabled transition or merely documented the final stages of a civilization that had been evaluated and found wanting. She returned to her research, methodical and absorbed, fundamentally changed by journey through conspiracy discovery and impossible choice, carrying wisdom purchased through ordeal and moral complexity that would define the rest of her life.